Well, good afternoon, everyone. Uh, we're on our way to winding down this semester. You have today's lecture and you have Thursday's lecture, and then you'll have a lecture on, you will have a review session with your teaching assistants on Tuesday. I'll show up for a little bit of that myself, make a few comments, and then I'll leave it to your TAs to talk about your preparation for the final exam. I sent you an email last night, I believe, that was intended to sort of pull together some of the ideas that I had about the rest of the semester. So make sure you read your email. It'll give you some pointers on what's going to happen for the rest of the semester. As I said in that email, your extra credits and your essays are due this Thursday. So make sure you take advantage of both of those things. That essay is an opportunity, since you control it, you write it, it's not under any timeline or anything. So make sure you write a good essay so your TAs can help you accumulate some points for your final exam or for your final grade. And we can talk about that a little bit at the end of this lecture. Let's see here. Sarah, you can see in my PowerPoint and everything?
Yes, I can.
Hear my voice okay?
Yes.
Can you see my shirt? You see what it says?
Just something. Just be civil.
Just be civil. Yes. How about that? It's my theme t-shirt of the day as we talk about civil rights. Let me first say that this is always a difficult lecture for me to deliver. You don't have to look very far to see that I am an old white guy. I am a history professor, but before I became a history professor, I was a lot of different things, including growing up in I would argue almost an all-white environment. I grew up in Oklahoma, Western Oklahoma, and Kansas, which even today are not exactly great integrated states. I moved to Detroit, Michigan when I was a teenager. I went to a very integrated university, Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, but I lived in a town that at the time was the largest all-white city in America. It was called Dearborn, Michigan, the home of the Ford Motor Company. I went to an all-white high school that was the integration of the diversity of our high school was essentially Middle East. We had a lot of people from Lebanon, a lot of people from Syria, Saudi Arabia, and we had tremendous sports in our high school. We won the state championship in football, not so much in basketball. As I said, we were an all-white high school, but we played against some great schools with large African-American populations. In fact, the first time anyone ever dunked a basketball at our high school was a young man by the name of Bobby Joe Hill, who went on to play for the national championship team at then called Texas Western, which is now UTEP. Bobby Joe dunked the ball. He was about 5'11", 5'10" maybe. And Bobby Joe played on that NCAA championship team that beat Kentucky, first black team to beat an all-white team. So my background up until the time I went in the Army was pretty much a white background. So I've given this lecture for the last 15 years or so, as I've talked about, as I've been a history professor, but never in my life did I anticipate giving a lecture in the wake of the things that are going on in America today. And I thought I had seen it all in the 1960s. I thought I had seen it all in the riots that took place in Watts and Cincinnati and Chicago and New York, Harlem, and even in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, which I will talk about today a little bit. So I am fully aware of the world that you all are living in, and hopefully that you will all lead us to better times. I'm aware of this class. I have 245 students, I believe, and I know we have many, many African-American students in this class. I'm aware of the controversy associated with policing. I'm aware of the controversy associated with an integrated society that used to be segregated. I teach History 2300 in addition to History 2301, and I teach the 400 years of slavery. I teach the Civil War. I know all about this stuff, but it's hard for me to explain it in terms of today. And I'm actually talking about today being literally today in some cases, and certainly in the last year. So I'm going to be giving you historical data today. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind about anything in your lives, except for the fact that I want you to know where it all came from. I want you to know where the controversy came from. I want you to know the reasons why, in some ways, we can say things are the way they are today. I know that many of you have come from much more integrated backgrounds than I did, at least growing up, which is a good thing. I always talk about the fact that I have a grandson who's a very good basketball player in Pearland, Texas. And he plays on basketball teams that are very integrated, in some cases where he might be the only white kid on the block, on the court at a time. And one of the things that always amazed me is that when he would show me a picture of his team, and I would make a question about somebody on the team, he wouldn't make any comment at all about skin color. He would make a comment about the color of socks, the color of a hat, the color of a headband, which makes so much more sense than the color of skin. So your generation is going to take us to the next level, we all hope. So I'm going to be explaining a lot of things today that maybe you don't know anything about, that will help you understand why our nation struggles so much over skin color. I don't understand it. I don't appreciate it, but it's there. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So I have on the screen several terms that you're going to need to know something about. Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. Those are sort of some of the very beginning things. There's a couple of terms that are very important that I don't have up there that I will talk more about and make sure that you understand them, because not only for purposes of examinations and things like that, but also for purposes that it's just something that you need to know about. Let me talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. 1896. There was a man named Plessy who happened to challenge the law in the state of Louisiana. He was interesting that he was 1/8 what we would call then Negro and 7/8 white. And yet it was known that he had, quote, black blood. And the law said that that made him black. Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy decided to challenge the law that was called separate but equal. That is, he got on a railroad car within the state of Louisiana. He got on a railroad car that was whites only, and it said whites only, and he challenged it, and he was thrown off, and he was considered to be a criminal for having gotten on the white car. So it went all the way through the court system, through the appellate systems, and eventually it went to the United States Supreme Court in 1896. And it challenged the idea of segregation. That is, blacks and whites being allowed by law to be separate as long as the conditions of the separateness were equal. Well, the truth of the matter was, he said they weren't equal. The black cars were not kept up as much. No one was cleaning the black cars. But the very idea that you would have to sit a certain place because of the color of your skin made no sense whatsoever to Plessy and a lot of other people. So it went all the way to the US Supreme Court. At that time, there were 8 justices. 7 of them said separate but equal is constitutional, that it does not violate the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And the one dissenting judge was the Chief Justice of that Supreme Court. But it stood 7-1. It stood, and it was the law of the land for the next 58 years. The law of the land being that separate but equal is constitutional. So what did that mean? That means it legalized the idea of separation based on skin color. So here we have a picture of a black man drinking from the fountain that has the term colored. There was another one for whites only. And I can tell you that this will stay in effect well into the 1970s, even after the great civil rights movements of the 1960s. I lived in Louisiana in the early 1970s, and they had bathroom facilities that said whites only, Negroes here, that sort of thing. Plessy versus Ferguson legalized segregation in America. Waiting room for whites only, according to this sign. Waiting room for whites only. Might be hard for you all to imagine these things, but it is the way that it was. In 1947, in what I consider to be one of the great profiles in courage, President Harry Truman ended segregation in the American military. It's called Executive Order 9981. Now let's think about this for a minute. You had a situation in World War I, which I talked about a little bit, where African Americans were considered to be cowards. And as a result of that, and it was wrong, but as a result of that, we had a situation where the military was so segregated in World War II that African Americans were virtually not allowed to fight for their country. They were put into non-combat armed situations with a few exceptions like the Tuskegee Airmen that we talked about. But Harry Truman said there's something wrong with this picture. How can we say that soldiers shouldn't fight together if they are Americans? And in many cases, they're fighting for the freedoms of an ally. In this case, in World War II, of course, it was the French and the British. In the case of Vietnam, it was not that. But by the time Vietnam came around, we had integrated forces. So President Truman, and when I call it a little bit of a profile in courage, I'm not trying to make the case that Harry Truman probably wasn't like a lot of presidents throughout our history, and that is that he was racist. I'm not trying to make the case that he wasn't, but at least he said, this is wrong. This is wrong that we have segregated forces. So what Harry Truman did was to integrate, to sign an executive order. It almost cost him his presidency in 1948 because a group of Democrats that called themselves the Dixiecrats broke away from the party and ran as third party and took a lot of the took a lot of the white vote from the South, and it almost cost him the election. But I do consider it to be a little bit of a political profile in courage because it did make a difference on integrating the military. I try to make the case that sometimes it's the military that does the best job of social engineering. Some argue that it shouldn't social engineer. I argue just the opposite. I argue that the military should be where social engineering takes place because even though we're fighting for the security of the United States of America, we're all Americans and we need everybody to be able to defend our country. And the idea that you couldn't defend your country if you happen to be black and fight alongside a white guy makes no sense whatsoever. Nor does it make any sense that you shouldn't be able to fight alongside somebody because you happen to be gay, or you happen to be a woman, or you happen to be transgender. As long as you can shoot straight, that's the way you ought to be able to fight for your country. That's the way I look at it. So, 1947. In 1954, in a lawsuit called Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, the law of Plessy versus Ferguson, the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, was reversed by a vote of the United States Supreme Court of 9-0, a unanimous vote. Now, if you can imagine a unanimous vote on anything today, this was unanimous. What the court said was that in education, there is something wrong with this picture. In the details of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education was essentially that the little girl Brown lived closer to the white elementary school than she lived to the black school that she had to go to. She had to be bused and taken to another school to be at the black school, and yet she lived right down the street from the white school. And so that's what this picture represents. So Brown versus Topeka Board of Education said that the United States of America, it is unconstitutional for people to be segregated because of skin color. The idea that you could ever have separate but equal makes no sense because there's no way to determine equality. Even if it did make sense, it's wrong. Under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, it's wrong to declare skin color as a criteria for anything. Brown versus Topeka. So you would think that as a result of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education saying that separate but equal is unconstitutional, you would think that this would be the end of it and nobody would worry about it anymore. Well, sadly, that's not the case, and it continued and continued and continued all through the next 20 years at least, and some would argue it's still continuing today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of those issues associated with what we refer to as the civil rights movement that we can argue starts in about 1950 after the integration of the armed forces. We know that coming out of the Civil War, we know that in the South, it was felt that slavery had ended, but as a result of slavery ending, there was still a feeling of superiority on the part of white people. And so the problem became that, that the white establishment, and I will talk about that being local sheriffs, mayors of towns, coming out of the Civil War, began to pass laws. You've heard them referred to as Jim Crow laws. Well, Jim Crow happened to be a character. That name comes as a character in one of these, what they call the minstrel shows, where white people wore blackface and sang, and essentially tried to replicate the lives of Black people during the slavery period prior to the Civil War. So in order to keep Black people, quote, in their place, Jim Crow laws made it very difficult for African Americans to hold jobs, African Americans to acquire and buy guns. It made it difficult for them to vote. Laws were passed requiring Black voters to take tests, which were not given to white voters. So in other words, if you were a white voter and you couldn't read, you could still put your X and vote. But if you were a Black voter, you had to be able to read. And in some states, it got so crazy that you not only had to be able to read, but you had to be able to read Aristotle and Socrates and know what it meant. In other words, it was unfair to ask Black people to do what you weren't asking white people to do. Jim Crow laws were, there were Jim Crow laws on various kinds of jobs, on which jobs you could have. In other words, from a white person's standpoint, let's try to keep it like it was during the segregation period, except for the ownership era. We're not going to own Black people, but we're going to control Black people if you happen to be white. So after Brown versus Topeka happens in '54, there was a complete pushback by the white communities. And I also want to say this, that there's going to be an argument made that this is all about the South. This is all about segregation in the South. It's all about the South trying to keep Black people in their place, so to speak. And I want to dispel that. I'm going to be talking about things that appear to be just about the South. But as I said, I lived in the whitest community in America, and it happened to be up north in Michigan. So it's not just about the South, even though some of these first indicators are about issues that happened in the South. In 1955, this guy, whose name you all know, I believe, his name is Martin Luther King, MLK. So a very young looking Martin Luther King in 1955. He calls for a boycott of the Montgomery bus system, which a lot of Black people were riding on. And the reason for that is because this woman, Rosa Parks, had been arrested riding a Montgomery bus. She was arrested for riding in the white-only section of that bus. She was asked to get up and allow a allow a white man to sit in her place, and she refused. Rosa Parks. She was taken to jail. There she is being fingerprinted for her refusal to get up and move because she happened to be Black and a white man wanted her seat. And it was this guy that said, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with this idea that you could have to give up your seat because of the color of your skin. Well, this sets off a series, and Martin Luther King, to his credit, sets off a series of boycotts in the South to change the way people look at your rights just because you happen to have a different color skin. In 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, because Brown versus Topeka Board of Education said no longer can we have separate high schools for Blacks only and separate high schools or separate schools of any level for white people. That's wrong under Brown v. Board of Education. In 1957, the President of the United States, who at this time happens to be former General Dwight David Eisenhower, forces the governor of the state of Arkansas. I'm going to give you his name. He's kind of important. His name was Faubus, Governor Faubus, F-A-U-B-U-S, Faubus. He tells Governor Faubus, President Eisenhower says to her, you can't do that. You can't keep Black people from attending the high school. This happens to be a picture that I sort of think is important. It shows a white woman yelling at a Black student who had been accepted into that high school. Governor Faubus at first said, I'm not going to allow this. And Eisenhower said, well, we're going to force the school system to allow Black students in this school. And if you don't call out the National Guard to make sure that these Black students are safe, if you don't do that, then I will federalize your National Guard. And he even threatened that he would do more than that, and that he would actually call in the federal troops. Faubus refused to call out his National Guard on his own. So Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and sent in the 101st Airborne Division to force the integration of Little Rock High School. And here you can see some pictures of the 101st Airborne Division escorting Black students into the Little Rock High School. We also see there during this time a lot of your age group from colleges in the North that will start a movement called Freedom Riders. And the Freedom Riders' goals were to go into the South and get the voting laws changed, allowing African Americans to vote with the same rules that white Americans are allowed to vote. In other words, those Jim Crow laws that were so prevalent needed to be changed. We will see attacks on the part of these freedom riders we will see them attacked for coming south to do this. And many of them were Northerners who would team up. It would be, a lot of them were Northern white students joining forces with Black students in the South and Black students in the North too. I don't want to minimize any of this. It was a very brave thing to do, because you can see this kind of an attack here with most of the local sheriffs in the South being white, being members of the Ku Klux Klan in many cases. We see a tremendous movement to stop these freedom riders from moving south and trying to help get Black people the right to vote. And then we see a movement against the colleges. In addition, we've now had elementary school with Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. We've had the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, and now we will see it at the collegiate level. This happens to be a picture of a man by the name of James Meredith. I'm now in 1962. James Meredith had been in the United States Air Force for 9 years. He applied to attend law school at the University of Mississippi. He was turned down. His application was turned down 5 times. The governor, who really didn't have the authority to do that, it was a registrar's job to decide who gets admitted, as it is at Texas Tech. Governor Abbott doesn't have any authority over telling Texas Tech University who can be admitted to the university. But Governor Barnett was his name. Governor Ross Barnett appointed himself registrar of the University of Mississippi. In the process of doing that, said, I now have the authority to decide who comes to school here. And I'm telling you, this Black guy is not coming to our university. James Meredith, 1962. Alabama, the city of Birmingham. I've put this phrase up here called Bombingham. This is a church. On a Sunday morning, 4 young Black girls were killed just trying to go to Sunday school. The Ku Klux Klan bombed the church. There's a very good documentary type movie by Spike Lee about this. On television, we saw the chief of police unleashing dogs against the demonstrations that took place over this. The explosion killed 4 young Black girls, and no one has ever been found guilty. Last year, there was 1 man found guilty, was it 50, 60 years later, of this murder. But the truth of the matter is, we had a new president of the United States, a young guy that I talked about last week by the name of John Kennedy. And John Kennedy didn't exactly have a great record of being a strong civil rights advocate. He was actually from Massachusetts. But the truth of the matter is, his record, he had actually voted against one of the civil rights laws that had been put forward. But when Kennedy saw this happen in 1962, he decided that this has to change. This has to change. There is something wrong with when you can't even go to church without feeling that you are in danger. So he acted to propose new civil rights legislation. And this would have been in 1962, right after this bombing. But the governor of Alabama was a guy by the name of George Wallace. And Governor Wallace had a reputation, and his reputation was, and he ran on this platform. His platform was, I say, his words were not mine, his words. I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That was George Wallace. Wallace will later on run for president of the United States in 1972, be shot, and then spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. But the leadership of the civil rights movement has pretty much fallen, well, not to one person, but we need to understand that there is not unanimity among those who believe in civil rights and how to get there. So in 1963, in August of 1963, over 200,000 people will go to Washington, D.C. This is the famous I Have a Dream speech that you may have heard about. Martin Luther King delivers the speech that day to a crowd that is not just African American, but there are many white supporters there too. But I wouldn't want to make it the case that it is anything like today, where we see a very integrated crowd trying to talk about civil rights. But in August 28, 1963, this very famous March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King, is one of the great speeches ever given by anyone. This is him speaking in 63. Of course, as I told you last week, he will be assassinated on April 7th of 1968. But at this time, it's not Martin Luther King's, he is not the only leader. There are many other leaders. One of the leaders that was at this day that just died a few months ago, John Lewis, was the youngest man there at the time. I think he was 28, as I recall, and was one of the early leaders of the civil rights movement. The famous march across the bridge at Selma he was one of those participants. But there was another guy that was preaching things a little bit different. Martin Luther King was a minister, a Baptist minister of the church down in Ebenezer Baptist Church down in Atlanta, Georgia, where his father had also been a minister. And he was a true man of the cloth, if we want to call him that, from the standpoint of being Dr. Martin Luther King with a divinity degree. And he was someone who believed that the answer to getting more rights that are due people just because they happen to be American, the answer was a movement of non-violence. Always confronting, but confronting in a non-violent way. But there was another man that was also a leader of the civil rights movement that believed differently. Malcolm X. Malcolm X believed in civil rights, but he believed that whatever it took to get there was the most important thing. He was Muslim. He was affiliated with Elijah Muhammad. He believed that Martin Luther King, in some ways, was what he referred to as an Uncle Tom. That is, somebody who would do the things that the white society wanted him to do. And he didn't believe that that was right. But his belief in using violence to fight violence was turned away completely by the white society. But let's think about that. so was Martin Luther King's non-violent ways turned back by white society. Malcolm X will be assassinated in 1965 by members of his own Black Muslim group. Martin Luther King will live for 3 years beyond Malcolm X and be assassinated in 1968. So we will see develop in America what is referred to as the Black Power movement. I have on the screen here a picture of the Black Panthers. Many of these Black Panther members, the Black Panther Party, it was founded in California, but it had units around the country. The Black Power movement, many of these Black Panther Party members were veterans of the Vietnam War. In some cases, we know that they were even sending parts back of weapons that could be reassembled here in the States that would give guns to Black Americans in California. I always like to make the case that one of the states that has the strongest gun control laws happens to be California. And it's a little bit different than today, where a lot of Republican states have very few gun control laws. But back in those days, the governor of the state of California, when a lot of this was going on, was a man by the name of Ronald Reagan, who will become president of the United States. And Ronald Reagan was for strong gun control in California. And one of the reasons for it was because the thing that white America feared was African Americans with guns. And the Black Panther Party became so strong in California that they passed laws that allowed, that it really restricted gun ownership. And the reason it restricted gun ownership was because of the fear of African Americans owning guns. Here is one of the supporters of the Black Panther Party. Her name is Angela Davis. At that time, she was a very young professor at the University of California, Berkeley. She's now an older professor. I think she's emeritus now. We were fortunate to invite her to Texas Tech just about 5 years ago, I believe it was now. Actually had her teach one of my classes. But she was thrown in jail for helping find weapons, in this case pistols, to arm the Black Panthers. Everybody was carrying guns, not just Black people, white people too, but if you happened to be Black and you were involved and caught carrying a weapon, you could be penalized, much more so than if you happened to be white and also carrying. That's Angela Davis. 1968. October of 1968, the Olympics that year happened to have been held in Mexico City. Mexico City, in this particular event, the gold medal, the man in the middle's name is Tommy Smith, S-M-I-T-H. The bronze medal, the guy behind him, was John Carlos. And the silver medal in the front, there's a guy from Australia. Well, the interesting thing about this is the Black Power, this became the Black Power movement sign, which is kind of interesting because those of us that weren't Black in Vietnam were using the same sign. But this became a huge controversy because during the playing of the national anthem, instead of these guys putting their hand over their heart, they put their hand in the air and bowed their heads during the playing of the Star Spangled Banner. Now, this is 1968, and these men were criticized tremendously by white America for doing this during the Star Spangled Banner. I put this up because I always think that it's ironic that we think about this at a time when it hasn't been too long ago, maybe 5 years ago, when Colin Kaepernick of the San Francisco 49ers, who happened to have taken them to the Super Bowl, didn't win the Super Bowl, but he played in the Super Bowl, decided to kneel during the playing of the Star Spangled Banner, and he was criticized for that. Put your arm in the air, you're criticized. Get on one knee, you're criticized. But both events, almost 50 years apart, were representing a concern about the way that African Americans were being treated in America. So what we see here is a time that in some ways nothing changed in that 50 years. Here's the symbol of the Black Panther Party. What we will see in the ensuing years from 1963, of course, President John F. Kennedy will be assassinated. When Lyndon Johnson takes over and is elected President of the United States, he will push, and in 1964, there will actually be a change in that there will be a law passed in 1964 that Kennedy couldn't get passed, but Johnson was able to. A Southerner, a white Southerner, got passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in employment and created a new organization in Washington called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. My sister-in-law happened to be one of the first members of that organization, first lawyers in that organization. That was in July of 1964. So it's while Lyndon Johnson is running for president against Barry Goldwater that I talked about last week. But that doesn't get it done. There's still this issue of voting rights. So it would not be until the summer of 1965, after LBJ is elected president on his own terms in November, that we will pass a Voting Rights Act of 1965. It banned literacy tests, and it allowed federal examiners to go into the South to make sure that African Americans were given the rights to vote, the same rights to vote that white Southerners were given. That's the outcome of that. Now, I have a picture up here of the Detroit riot of 1967. This happens to be one of many riots that will take place across America. Watts in California, Harlem in New York City, Cincinnati, Cleveland. I put this picture up here because I happen to have been there for this. I was a college student at Wayne State University, studying under a very fine African-American sociologist, social psychologist in the summer. And it was one of those deals where you say, how does this kind of thing happen? Late in the evening, think about 2 o'clock in the morning, actually, after a very good day at the ballpark, Detroit Tigers were in the pennant race that year. And there was what we call a blind pig. Happened to be a bar that's open after midnight, and it happened to be in a black neighborhood, and it happened to be African Americans that were doing it, even though in white Detroit there were blind pigs everywhere. It's what you did when the bars closed. You had your own bar, set up your own bar. Well, the police raided it, arrested some people, and the next thing you know, buildings were being set on fire and people were taking to the streets. At this time, there was the governor of the state of Michigan was a man by the name of George Romney. Yes, he was Mitt Romney's dad, the guy that ran for president back in 2012 and happens to now be a United States senator from Utah. George Romney was a candidate for president of the United States, or he was probably going to run for president in 1968 against what we thought would be probably Lyndon Johnson, even though based on last week's lectures, you know that Lyndon Johnson did not run for president in 1968. He decided not to run. But George Romney was expected to be a candidate for president of the United States. And so when the riot started, it was on a Saturday night, so it started on Sunday, big time. The riot got out of control, and the National Guard of the state of Michigan was called out by Governor Romney. And Lyndon Johnson went on the airways and said that Governor Romney had failed to keep the peace in Detroit, and therefore he was calling out the federal troops. Probably true that things weren't in control because the National Guard, which was made up of a lot of draft dodgers that didn't want to go to Vietnam. Nothing against the National Guard. I've said that before. I love the National Guard, but the National Guard then was made up more of people that didn't want to go to Vietnam than it was of anything else. But the National Guard in those days took over the west side of Detroit, and about 40 people were killed, either by National Guardsmen or some National Guardsmen were killed also. They did not control the city on the west side the way they should have. So President Johnson brings in the 82nd Airborne Division from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, mostly made up of African American Vietnam veterans. Those guys took to the streets with their M16 rifles, wearing their airborne t-shirts, and they didn't fire a shot. And they controlled the east side, which was where most of the problems were. It's one of the great lessons in riot control that when you bring in a force, just the existence and the show of force is enough to stop bad things from happening. So the Detroit riot comes to an end. That's in '67. A year later, Detroit is one of the more peaceful places in America, even though cities are erupting everywhere with riots because of conditions, poverty, a lot of different socioeconomic issues. But the truth of the matter is, in 1968, Detroit was one of the more peaceful cities. And one of the reasons for that is because the Detroit Tigers were in a pennant race, which ended up with them winning the World Series. And sports sort of brought the city together in 1968, where it had failed in 1967. Nothing could have brought it together that year because of the terrible things that were happening in America. I'm going to stop with that and open it up to questions. This is certainly a brief look at the civil rights movement. It's not all-encompassing. You can take courses in African American history. You can take courses at Texas Tech by a lot of professors that do this as their research. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Professor.
Kevin.
Yeah. Do you know what Rosa Parks was actually charged with?
Yeah, her actual charge, as I recall, was disrespect or not following the laws because it was legal. It was even though it was illegal, even though it was illegal under Brown versus Board, because it happens in '55. It was the law in the state of Alabama and in the local laws of the city of Birmingham, it was illegal for her to sit in the white section. So she broke a local law.
Huh. Wow. Thank you. I was actually curious about what she actually was charged with. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm not sure what the law, the wording of the law is. I'm sure you can probably Google and find it. But the truth of the matter is, it was a local law supported by a state law that violated a federal law. On the other hand, this will continue for the next 20 years, where states' laws will have to be overridden by the federal government. But as you know, it takes forever to get these things through the appellate system to get them to the Supreme Court. And then once you're there, what have you got? Well, in some cases, you've still got nothing unless the local people are willing to enforce those laws. Anyone else? No questions?
I have a question.
Julia, do I
Julia.
pronounce it right?
Yeah, Julia. It's
Okay.
about the extra credit. So like there were some like that were due earlier. Is it only the ones that are for 429 that are due tomorrow on Thursday, or like can we use it from like earlier?
No, anything that's due on 429 is what's in the syllabus that says it's due on 429.
Okay.
The
Okay.
others were due previously, yes.
Okay, perfect. I just was confused. Thank you.
And there's still a lot of those left.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And if you're looking for recommendations in the next 2 days, it's going to be whatever you can find probably. But there are some really good films there, and some of them have nothing to do with some of my lectures so far. There's even a couple of comedies there. There's a movie called Dick, which is a comedy about Watergate, or comedy about Richard Nixon, if you can imagine such a thing. There's a movie called Failsafe, and there's a movie called Dr. Strangelove, which is one of the great movies of all times. Talks about the Cold War. There's even a couple, I think I even have Easy Rider on there, which is a biker movie, for God's sakes. So I got some pop culture things going. So there's a lot of interesting film there. Just make sure, if you're going to do extra credit, just make sure that you follow the rules laid out in the syllabus regarding how you write those reviews, because there can sometimes be a tendency on the part of students to think that they can find a review of a movie that they didn't watch or something, and that's not only is not fair, but I know every one of those movies, and I know every one of those movie reviews because I teach film. And so please don't do that. It's the best way to put it.
When's the last day to turn in extra credit?
This Thursday.
I have a question.
Where?
I guess who are the name of the athletes that did the fist up at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City?
Yeah, Tommy Smith and John Carlos are those two men, very famous, great athletes. And one of them I think John Carlos became a sociology professor after the Olympics, and does a lot of sports, still alive, I believe, does a lot of sports psychology things. Yeah, it was quite a moment. I remember it. I do remember it. I was in the Army. But I do remember it. Anything else?
I have a question.
Alex.
Go ahead.
Yes,
So
sir.
I know following the Minneapolis riots, it really hurt the local economy because a lot of local businesses burned down. So following the Detroit riots, did the riots hurt burn a lot of local businesses, hurting the economy? And did that help contribute to the decline of Detroit, or is that just purely because industry leaving?
There are several things that contributed to the downturn of the economy. That would be one of them. We had what we call in Detroit, we had what we call white flight. There were people that lived in downtown Detroit that were then afraid to live in integrated neighborhoods. So they moved out and created some new suburbs. One of them called Livonia, Michigan, and called Novi, Michigan, and Northville, Michigan. Dearborn was already all white, and it was right next door to Detroit. But in addition to that, I argue, as a Detroit resident of that time, and then I lived in Detroit for another 12 years, I guess, after the war. I would also argue that the automobile industry refusing to compete properly with the Japanese automakers, refusing to go robotics early on, refusing to make, in some ways, I would even argue, and my father-in-law was a Ford Motor Company employee, I would even argue that they didn't make, in some cases in those early days, didn't make as good a car as the Japanese cars. So the automobile industry went south. And when the automobile industry went south, it happened. Detroit went, turned that way. But then the other interesting thing that happened is there was a new resurgence, and they built what they call the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit. And white people may move back, and Detroit took off again. And I would also argue there was an economic reason for that, because Detroit started making better cars and competing with the world automakers. So I don't think we can just blame it on that. It's always, whenever we talk about things that happen that are have a racial component, there's usually an economic component that sometimes isn't caused because of the racial issues. So it's a very complex thing.
Thank you.
Who else?
This is a bit of a more personal thing. So the whole thing with George Wallace, I actually have learned a bit about him through music. Have you heard of Drive-By Truckers?
No.
The band Drive-By Truckers? They're
No.
really good. My dad got me into them. In a couple songs in their album, Southern Rock Opera, they have a couple really good songs about George Wallace and his whole thing. Apparently, towards the end of his life, he kind of turned around and tried to be a better person. And before that, he had actually run against someone who was a segregationist, lost horribly, and then decided, okay, that got me votes. I'll go for being a segregationist. And he was, it was interesting.
Yeah, Wallace is a complex guy. He left office after he was shot. He appointed his wife, I think, became governor then. He did an interview before his death, right before his death, actually, he did an interview with John Kennedy Jr. in a magazine called George, which was John Kennedy's magazine. Really good magazine. A very sad thing when he died. But he did an interview with George Wallace in which Wallace sort of denounced his segregationist ways. Of course, the song, if you know anything about Leonard Skinner, "Sweet Home Alabama," that song refers to George Wallace and refers to Neil Young of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young at that time. So yeah,
there's in that whole sorry to interrupt, but in that whole album, the main thing is the story of Leonard Skinner. In fact, it ends with the plane crash.
Yeah. Killed Ronnie.
If you get the chance, if you get the chance, I'd check them out. They're really, really interesting. My dad got me into them.
Yeah, I like Southern rock. I've seen Leonard Skinner in concert many, many times. They performed here a few years ago in Lubbock. They performed as the opening act to ZZ Top. My wife's tennis partner is the drummer of ZZ Top, so we always got good tickets whenever ZZ Top performed anywhere. Anyone else?
For the extra credit, we could do two
Colby.
of those, correct?
Give me it again.
For the extra credit, we could do two of those, right?
You can earn up to 4 points, okay? And you get 2 points for each film, potentially 2 points for each film. You also could have gotten 2 points. If you've already earned 2 points, you can only earn 2 more. If you've earned them by already turning in a film, or if you've earned them by going to the conference 2 weeks ago or anything like that. 4 points is the maximum amount of points that you can have for extra credit for the course.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? Well, very good. We're going to do the end of the Cold War and anything else I can think of next Thursday. I look forward to seeing you all then. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.